Wetpixel Live. My name's Adam Hanlon. I'm the editor of Wetpixel, and I'd like to introduce you to my fellow presenter, Alex Mustard. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Adam. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to see you. What we thought we might discuss today is something that's very, very close to both our belief systems, I suppose, both our hearts, is that we're both very strong feeling towards making sure that any images that we capture are captured in a very ethical way. And so what happened a few years ago was Paddy had displayed a picture on one of their social media channels that displayed an octopus being draped over the back of a turtle. And certainly at the time, my feeling was that was probably not a display of a particularly good set of ethics on behalf of the particular photographer. So as a result of that, we contacted Paddy. Paddy actually acted very efficient, very quick, very swiftly, removed the post and actually issued an apology on their social media channels for posting it. And then they asked us to develop a set of guidelines. So what I've got here is I've got the guidelines that we developed. And Alex and I are going to kind of run through those guidelines and try and give you some context as to how we feel we can capture underwater images in an ethical way. So here are the guidelines. There's Alex. If we just scroll through, so that's the preamble. But then, so in our guidelines, our first guideline was do no harm. So Alex, do you want to expand on this idea of doing no harm as an underwater photographer?
Well, yeah, I know, I'm sure most people watching this are going, well, of course. And that's the attitude of almost everyone. But I think it's important to start with this basic point of view, is that as an underwater photographer, you want to be going underwater to celebrate the amazing wildlife that's down there. And you to produce images that do so, you certainly don't want to be doing any harm to that environment. And I think, this is, obviously not a guideline that most people need to be told, but it was important to start with that very strong message. That said, although a lot of us go underwater not wanting to cause harm, we can inadvertently cause harm by carelessness, by when our ambition to want to get the photo maybe exceeds our diving skills. Even just for a few seconds, it can be bad. So it's important, I think, to keep this in the front of our minds so that we go about things in the best way. And all of us make mistakes underwater. I definitely do. Other people do. But I think if it's in our mind that, gosh, I feel really bad about that, I'm not going to do that again, it'll keep our behavior improving and improving.
I think one of the things we mentioned in our initial top 5 tips for underwater photographers is this idea that diving skills are very, very, very important. And obviously this is a really good example of a place where having really good diving skills is critical if we're going to interact in a marine environment and do no harm. So, spending that bit of time just making sure that you get your buoyancy control and everything else really spot on is a very, very important part of this idea of doing no harm. The second guideline that we highlighted was the idea of not touching. And certainly I know Alex and I have had some experiences where we've been mobbed by friendly seals. And they were wonderful experiences. And obviously these are examples where it's not so much us doing the touching, it's the seals doing the touching to us. And perhaps they should read the rules. I'm trying to think of
another point in life where you're not allowed to touch, but you're allowed to be touched. I'm struggling.
Probably something not worth thinking about too hard. But certainly, I think the crucial thing here is that we need to be sure that we don't touch in a way that negatively impacts on the animal and the animal's welfare.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's really important. I think just getting that attitude. I think one thing that I really don't like is, yes, when we dive in cold water, we need to wear gloves as divers to keep our fingers warm. When we dive in the tropics, when the water is warm, I'm increasingly seeing more and more photographers wearing gloves. And these aren't gloves for thermal insulation. They're gloves to allow them to touch things without the risk of getting stung or scratched. And I think one of the best things you can do as an underwater photographer is to go diving without gloves on. I actually think one of the best things is to dive in shorts and a rash vest when you can. And I'm a big fan of when the water's warm enough in not wearing a suit. And I know you are as well, Adam. And I think that's also really good. Going diving in shorts is a really good way of making sure that your buoyancy is really good. I think all that neoprene we have to wear sometimes and we often wear at other times can make us insulated from the environment, and that can lead to some of the touching that goes on. It's not just with your fingers, but with your legs bumping into something or something like that. And certainly bare hands for me is a really valuable way of keeping people. I think as an underwater photographer, though, you have to recognize that sometimes you do need to steady yourself. And I think for me, I'm perfectly fine with a photographer putting a couple of fingers down on an area that they've looked at in the underwater world that's clearly not part of a living animal, so that they can steady themselves, because underwater you're completely neutrally buoyant. It's very easy to steady yourself with just a couple of fingers, and that can allow you to maneuver closely to a subject and still be in good control over your body and to make good pictures. So for me, it's about not touching obvious marine life. There are times underwater where you might decide to touch the seabed, and there's dives like manta dives where the advice from the dive operators is please settle on the seabed, because that way the mantas will be relaxed. So there are times, obviously, when as a photographer you might be touching things.
I think that the other element of touch that we probably want to touch on, excuse me, so we want to talk about briefly is there are individuals that for various reasons may choose to move or reposition animals, and this is typically a problem with macro subjects, and we rarely get people repositioning whale sharks. And obviously the temptation here is that the critter is not in a particularly good position, so by picking up and moving it, we put it in a better position and therefore create a more pleasing image. Now, there are all sorts of issues around that to do with animal welfare, but I think for me the biggest problem with that type of behaviour is that part of our job as underwater photographers is to portray the underwater world as it is, not as we would wish it to be. And by moving stuff around and creating artificial scenes, we're effectively giving the people that view our image an unrealistic impression of what's going on underwater. And I think that's basically unethical and obviously largely really dishonest, because very few people actually will admit the fact that they move stuff around. So obviously, when we say do not touch, first of all, is obviously not touching in order to avoid damaging things inadvertently, but also deliberate touching is something that we really want to avoid.
And I think it's also something that I think competitions can really help reinforce. I know the majority of the good underwater photography competitions try very hard not to award pictures that have been manipulated. Obviously, there's lots of pictures coming in, and everything can always slip past the judges. They try and do their best, but they're not infallible. But I think anyone who sat in on a judging room of any of the major competitions, they'd really be amazed by how judges are really strong on this. So I think also, if you want your pictures to be successful in competitions, going about taking them the right way is really important. And even if you do slip past the judges and you get awarded, it's actually often even worse, because then suddenly the results come out and all your peers are going, well, that picture there is a bit dodgy. And so I think you have to be it's also important for your own reputation that you don't get tarnished for these things. And I think perhaps something I feel a bit sad about in underwater photography is that there are people out there that the whole community sort of recognizes as being the bad eggs, the people who aren't behaving well. But they tend not to get confronted very much, partly because people often travel in their kind of bubble of friends and don't necessarily meet people from outside of that. So no one sort of questions their behavior within that bubble. But I also, very aware, I hear stories, when I travel the world about certain well-known photographers who don't behave well, and the majority do behave really well. But there's a few, and you hear the same names coming up again and again. But I've never confronted one of those names, and I do feel bad about that sometimes. But, it's, I think it's worth mentioning.
Indeed. I mentioned, I'm just scrolling onto this article here. So the next guideline that we had was to impact on the animal's terms, and to some extent, I think we've given ourselves away here or I've given myself away, should I say, by mentioning seals. But I think one of the things that is an amazing thing for anybody to experience underwater is when a wild animal, a marine animal in this case, chooses to interact with you, and we should cherish those moments because they're very special and very unique. And there is, I would say, one side of obviously the social media sphere, particularly, which can be quite critical of images. If the animal chooses to interact with you, I have no issue with interacting with it, and I actually also have no issue really with showing those pictures of the animals' interactions in social media and everything else. This needs to be balanced against it looking like there's something wrong going on. But in general, if an animal chooses to interact, I think we should be able to share it.
I think baiting becomes a more difficult question to deal with, because I think with that, the animal is choosing to react to the bait, but you're choosing to bait it. And obviously, as underwater photographers, we don't use bait very much. Wildlife photographers on land use bait a lot more frequently than we do as underwater photographers. But there are certain species, and sharks are the very obvious example, where the majority of pictures are taken on baited dives. There are obviously exceptions, but there are baited dives, from whale sharks being attracted by releasing small amounts of netted small fish, all the way up to white sharks being pulled in with a tuna head. But I think there's also other areas of baiting and attraction that are worth considering in baiting. And most blackwater dives, the animals are baited in by attracting their prey to lights. And you are, in the same way as a baited dive with sharks, you are altering their behavior to do those things. Now, all those things the animal is choosing to react to, and generally I'm fine. But I think it's important as photographers that we realize that those things that we all like to do are altering things a little bit, but they're obviously, you're not going to get those blackwater encounters without attracting the animals to light. You're not going to get sharks in photographic range without using the bait. And I'm fine with those things, but I think we need to be aware that we are altering the behavior when we do them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings us very neatly onto the last guideline, which was choose how you browse. And I guess as photographers, I can modify that slightly. It's not only how we browse, it's choose what we share. So, I think as photographers, we all have images of animals behaving in ways that we don't expect. Possibly they do weird things sometimes, and some of those reactions may be or could be seen as being due to a negative interaction with the animal. And the point then is, at that point, I wouldn't share that image. That image, I've got it, or I might delete it actually, but certainly it's not something that would ever I would choose to show on social media. And I think the baited issue is one that you portray really well, Alex. There are, for great shark photography, typically is done on dives that involve using bait. Not all, but a lot of it is. And as photographers, we have a choice whether we show pictures of the sharks on the bait or pictures of the sharks away from the bait. And my choice is always, in those circumstances, to show pictures of sharks in blue water away from the bait, where there's lots of opportunities, and not to show the ones of them actually on the bait. And
I think that's also how nature photographers on land use whether it's peanuts for garden birds or whatever bait they're using. And I think I'm not interested in photographing a diver hand feeding a shark, but I do want to use the fact that there's bait in the water to attract sharks into photographic range. So yeah, I completely agree. And that comes back to kind of that first point about showing the oceans in the right way. It's celebrating the nature of the oceans in our pictures rather than celebrating this unrealistic view, when we are altering behavior.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, and it's about making sure that we show the oceans as a place of wonder and beauty. There's a small caveat to that, in that occasionally things happen that you're not expecting. And we should be prepared to be open-minded as browsers, probably more than photographers, as to the nature of an image, and to try and discover the circumstances in which it's captured before we rush to judgment. There is a temptation, particularly on social media, for there to be a bit of a lynch mob that happens sometimes when people see images that portray behaviours that they don't believe is natural. In some cases, they may be correct. I wouldn't deny that, but it's always worth finding out the photographer's what the photographer did to create the image, or how to create the image, before we rush to judgment. I think it's important in terms of how we deal with our fellow human beings, as well as how we interact with the marine environment.
Yeah, and I think I've said it in lots of talks, and I'm sure we'll discuss it on a future episode of Wetpixel Live. But I do think an area that a huge number of underwater photographers are not well educated enough in is in marine life. And even a lot of the people who are very quick to criticize images for manipulation, you then ask them, oh, what's that fish in your picture? And they're like, I haven't got a clue. I don't care. I don't know. And, and I think that underwater photographers They know everything about their cameras, they know everything about their technology, but there is a lack of good knowledge about the ocean and about marine life. And I think that's something that can improve all of our pictures.
Yeah, absolutely. In lots of different ways, not just in terms of looking after the environment, but also in terms of simply being able to capture better pictures, because we can, by being able to predict animals' behavior, we can be in the right place at the right time. So it has a huge benefit to all photographers.
I think the final point that I'd want to make in this quick discussion today is that it is also important for us as underwater photographers to show the problems that the ocean is facing. And that can mean taking pictures of animals suffering, from people, showing problems of pollution, of fishing in the ocean. And those pictures obviously have a different set of ethics to some degree. But I think what's really important is that those pictures are honest. And there's certainly been a lot of discussion in nature photography on land and a little bit underwater about actually, because those pictures have become so valuable, that photographers are actually staging some of these situations, or certainly encouraging them to happen so that they can get the pictures. I'm not suggesting that underwater photographers are suddenly going to become shark finners, but rather than stopping a shark finner and explaining why they shouldn't be doing it, they're maybe quite happy to let it go on so that they can get the shots of it, because they know those shots are valuable. And in a bigger picture term, that might be the case, but I think that's something, particularly as ethical photography of wanting to show these problems in the ocean is rising, creating them ourselves. I've heard stories about photographers taking plastic bags down in their pockets so that they can let go of them when they encounter some marine life, to get photos of that marine life with the plastic bag. Now, of course, the photographer is retrieving the plastic bag afterwards. But I think people who are doing those things to create those images need to think about the ethics of that. And I think it's a relatively new area, but it's something for us to think about in the future.
Yeah, it definitely boils down to ethics, doesn't it? Yeah. So that was the article that we shared on Wetpixel. It was an article from a while ago, and I think it still forms a fairly good basis for a series of guidelines to allow us to create images in an ethical way. I think for today's
it's a topic we'll come back and talk about
I'm sure
again and again. I think there's lots of different ways of approaching this, and I think it's something that underwater photographers, there's no trying to make a definitive ruling on it is not important as actually having a continuous dialogue. That it's something that we're always thinking about, always talking about, and it's always in our minds whenever we go underwater. It's not just, are my O-rings clean? Is my vacuum pump on? It's also, am I going to go about my diving in the right way? And it's something we need to be reminded of and talk about regularly to keep it in the front of our minds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's it's one of the fundamentals, isn't it? So I'm going to sign off now, but thank you, Alex, very much for yet more words of wisdom. People want to see more of your pictures, where do they need to go?
You can check me out on Instagram at AlexMustard1 is a good place to go.
It's as a profusion of beautiful imagery. So thanks again, Alex. We'll say cheers now. And just to thank you all again for watching this episode. I hope it's provided some entertainment, but also given you some food for thought when you capture pictures underwater. I'd like to thank our sponsor. In this case, it's been XIT404, who very kindly made this episode possible. If you enjoy this content, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, and also feel free to add comments. If you suggest topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, we'll try and do so. And obviously, there's likes and everything else on the YouTube just below this video. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.